If you were one of the millions of unlucky ones who got sick during the Black Death, this is the last face you saw before you died. Some of the scariest horror stories come from the history books. Today I will tell you the story of the plague doctors of the Middle Ages. Imagine that you lived in London during the 1300s. One day, you wake up and notice that there is some swelling in the glands in your neck. By that evening, you start to get the chills and severe muscle aches. The next day, you start vomiting blood. Your family is horrified, so they summon the local plague doctor. The doctor doesn't arrive until the next day, and by that time you are barely conscious. The tips of your fingers are starting to turn black from gangrene. The plague doctor finally arrives at your bedside, and you are woken up by the plague doctor roughly poking you with his cane. He says, "You are very sick, my child, but don't worry, I am going to cure you." You see the doctor pull out a dirty knife, and you feel a sharp pain as the doctor slices into your arm. Blood begins pouring out of your arm, a lot of blood. You quickly start to get dizzy. The world starts to go black, and the last thing you see is the plague doctor's mask. You were one of the lucky ones. Your death was a quick and painless one. In the mid-14th century, the Black Death fell upon Europe. A deadly disease known as the bubonic plague swept across the continent, killing tens of millions of people. It is said that nearly half of the European population died of the plague during the Black Death. It was a time of unimaginable horror, a time when the world seemed to be on the brink of the abyss. In the midst of this chaos, a peculiar figure emerged, the plague doctor. Cloaked in a dark robe, face hidden behind a beaked mask, they became harbingers of death, warning signs that the Black Death was near. The plague doctor's beak-shaped mask was designed to hold aromatic substances such as dried flowers, herbs, spices, or a vinegar sponge. The prevailing medical theory of the time was miasma theory, that diseases were spread through bad smells. The strong smells of these substances in the beak were believed to purify the air and protect the wearer from the disease. Most of the real doctors of the time fled from the cities, with the rest of those with the financial means to escape. The healers who remained were often charlatans, exploiting the fear and desperation of the afflicted for their own gain. These unscrupulous individuals, posing as healers, sold false cures and performed harmful treatments, adding to the suffering of the people they promised to help. Welcome, dear viewers, to a journey back in time, to an era that tested the resilience of humanity like no other. This is a tale of despair, death, and fear. This is the story of the plague doctors. London was a city under siege, not by an army of men, but by an invisible enemy that brought with it suffering and death. The year was 1348, and the Black Death had wrapped its cold, merciless hands around the city. The once bustling streets, filled with the chatter of merchants and the laughter of children, now echoed with cries of despair and fear. The cobblestone streets, usually teeming with life, were now narrow pathways of dread. The houses, once filled with warmth and joy, stood silent, their doors marked with a painted cross, a grim sign of the plague's presence. The air was heavy with the scent of burning herbs, a futile attempt to ward off the disease that was consuming the city. In the midst of this chaos, a figure moved with purpose. He was a man in his early 40s, his face hidden behind a beaked mask, his body cloaked in a long, dark robe. He was not a knight nor a priest, but a self-proclaimed healer. He was not there to save the city, but to exploit its despair. His name was not known, nor was it asked. To the fearful and desperate populace, he was simply the plague doctor. He moved through the city's narrow streets, his beaked mask and dark robe a beacon of false hope in the city's darkest hour. His potions, nothing more than colored water and crushed herbs, were sold as a miraculous cure. The desperate people clung to this false hope, their fear blinding them to the deceit. The man, driven by greed and a complete disregard for human life, reveled in their desperation. He was not a savior, but a predator, and the City of Shadows had become his hunting ground. In the heart of the city, where the cobblestone streets twisted and turned like a labyrinth, the man known as the Plague Doctor made his deceitful rounds. Beneath his beaked mask hid a face hardened by greed and devoid of empathy. His victims were the sick and the dying, those too weak to see through his lies. He would knock on their doors, his presence a promise of salvation. The families, their eyes filled with fear and desperation, would welcome him in, their homes becoming his stage. He would set up his tools with a show of professionalism, his every movement calculated to inspire trust. His tools were as deceptive as his potions, a sharp knife for bloodletting, a bundle of herbs to ward off the bad air, and his most prized possession, his potions. His potions were a clever concoction of colored water and crushed herbs, their only power being the false hope they instilled. He would administer them to his patients, his words a soothing balm to their fear. "This will cure you," he would say, his voice as cold and empty as his promises. But his deceit didn't end there. He would offer his services to the terminally ill, engaging in harmful bloodletting procedures under the guise of treatment. Truth be told, the plague doctor had never seen a single patient improve after a bloodletting. Yet his patients, desperate and weakened by the bubonic plague, would gladly pay 10 pence, sometimes more, for the treatment. He showed no compassion, no empathy for the suffering, instead profiting from the desperation and hopelessness that gripped the family members of the sick and dying. Over time, the plague doctor's reputation grew. His name was whispered in hushed tones, his potions sought after like precious gold. He moved through the city like a shadow, his presence a constant reminder of the city's despair. His patients were the city's most vulnerable, their bodies weakened by the plague, their spirits crushed by fear. He would visit them in their homes, his arrival a beacon of false hope in their darkest hour. His treatment was a cruel mockery of real medicine. He would take his sharp knife, its blade glinting in the dim light, and make a small incision on the patient's arm. He would then place a bowl beneath the wound, allowing the blood to flow freely. This was bloodletting, a common practice believed to balance the body's humors. But it was, of course, nothing more than a harmful procedure that weakened his patients further. He would watch as the life drained from his patients, their faces growing paler, their breaths shallower. He showed no compassion, no empathy for their suffering. His eyes, hidden behind the beaked mask, were cold and detached, reflecting the darkness of his soul. Once the procedure was done, he would administer his counterfeit remedies, his words a soothing lullaby to the dying. "This will cure you," he would say, his voice as hollow as his promises. His patients, too weak to see through his deceit, would cling to his words, their hope a fragile flame in the face of death. As the sun set and the city of London was shrouded in darkness, the plague doctor's true nature emerged. He was not a healer, but a thief, his greed as deadly as the plague he pretended to cure. His victims were his patients. Once they had succumbed to the disease, he would return under the cover of night. He moved through the city's narrow cobblestone streets with the stealth of a cat, his dark robe blending with the shadows. He would approach the homes of his deceased patients. He would enter their homes, their doors unlocked in their grief. He moved through their rooms with a cold detachment, his eyes scanning for valuables. He took their silver, their jewelry, their keepsakes. He left the grieving families with nothing but the painful memories of their lost loved ones. Many of the family members would become sick as well, and the doctor would often be called back by the desperate families he had just stolen from. During the Black Death, the city of London was a ghost of its former self, its streets silent, its homes empty. The plague had taken its toll, leaving behind a city of shadows. In the midst of this despair, fate played its cruel hand. The plague doctor, the man who had exploited the city's fear and desperation, contracted the very disease he pretended to cure. The bubonic plague, an invisible enemy that had brought the city to its knees, had found its way to him. He felt the first signs of the disease in the form of a high fever, his body burning as if on fire. He dismissed it as fatigue, a consequence of his nightly exploits. But as the days passed, his condition worsened. He developed painful swellings, his skin turning a ghastly black. He was racked with pain, his body a battlefield for the deadly disease. He found himself alone. His potions, his counterfeit remedies were useless against the disease. He was a healer without a cure, a predator turned prey. He was confined to his bed, his strength sapped by the disease. The plague doctor, the man who had brought false hope to a desperate city, was now at the mercy of the very disease he had exploited. He was alone, without aid or comfort, his fate a cruel twist of irony. The man, once a predator, now lay weak and defeated in his bed. He had been suffering from the plague for nearly 10 days. His body was racked with pain, his breaths shallow and labored. The disease had taken its toll, leaving him a mere shell of the man he once was. He was alone, his only company, the grim spectre of death. But then a figure emerged in his doorway. It was another plague doctor, his beaked mask and dark robe a chilling echo of the disguise he himself had once worn. This new arrival was no savior, but a predator, just as ruthless and unscrupulous as he had been. The new plague doctor entered the dim, squalid room without a word. His eyes, hidden behind the beaked mask, scanned the room, taking in the sight of the man lying in bed, his body ravaged by the disease. There was no compassion in his gaze, no empathy for the suffering man before him. He approached the bed, his movements slow and deliberate. He reached into the man's pocket, his gloved hand emerging with a coin purse. The man watched in silent despair as the new plague doctor stole his last remaining possessions, his actions a cruel reminder of his own past deeds. As his vision faded, the plague doctor loomed over him. As he lay dying, gasping for breath, the beaked mask looking down at him was the last image he saw. The plague doctor had met his end. He died alone, without aid or comfort.